Hello and welcome. This is a frightening piece of news, which of course has been around for a while. By 2030, a billion Indians will be in the workforce. A majority of that workforce will be obsolete even before they start working. There's a fundamental challenge ahead for the Indian economy and the polity as it happens, which is jobs. More than 12 million people are coming into the workforce every year, and a lot of them will not get jobs unless there is sufficient economic growth and sufficient momentum in the economy. We've been addressing this issue from various points of view. We've already had one conversation with Subir Gokarn at the Brookings Institute, also former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. Let's now go on to the second part, where we try and understand what could be the policy prescriptions for some of the challenges that are arising because of the lack of jobs, and of course what could happen if we don't address the issues raised. So Subir joins us once again. Shortly to be joining us will be Ashok Bhattacharya, editor of the Business Standard newspaper as well, and that's where the original column from Subir appeared just yesterday. Subir, thank you very much for speaking with us once again. So we've outlined the problem, which is as dire as it gets. It's also obviously become a fairly heightened political issue, considering, given that many people have started saying that they see that the BJP, for instance, may have all the magic solutions to solve the jobs problems by creating the growth and so on. The Congress, of course, has its own solutions, which in some ways have been playing out in the last few years. So what are the key challenges as you see ahead from a policy prescription and delivery point of view at this point?
Well, I think, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay.
So I think we've got to accept, and this was a key point in my article. We've got to accept the fact that the way technology is moving is essentially labor displacing. That is, as we go forward in time, that old model of putting lots of people to work in big factories producing shirts or shoes or iPads or whatever, that model is completely in itself, essentially now history. The future for factories lies in essentially automation, robots, very, very highly integrated technological processes, where the average worker is going to have skill levels, training levels, and also obsolescence rates. I'm particularly emphatic on obsolescence rates. That is, people will be displaced very fast. 3 years, 5 years, and then you're not. Somebody's going to come and do the job better, right, because he's better trained or whatever. So we should not be looking at the way China did things, or before that the way Korea or Taiwan or Malaysia or Thailand did things, because they were the beneficiaries of an essentially relatively labor-intensive kind of regime, kind of environment, and they were able to put large numbers of people to work in producing these things. I think we have to worry about whether that model is replicable. If that doesn't happen, then obviously labor is always going to be used. There's always going to be demand for labor. We have to figure out where, what kinds of activities are labor going to be used in most. How do we ensure that our growth path, our growth strategy emphasizes those activities, which is then the only way in which you're going to put more people to work. And the second point is that even in those activities, people are going to become de-skilled very quickly, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. So you have to have, and this is a point I was trying to make in the previous one, but I wasn't very audible. Our strategy for training is focused on early career, entry-level workers. That is what Dilip Chinna was talking about the other day. But we need to have a program, a strategy which allows for mid-career and repeated mid-career reskilling if you're going to keep people at work for 35, 40 years of their lives. Both of these are integral, critical elements of the strategy, and there are many more which we can talk about, but those are the two that I want to put on the table first.
Subir, the question and concern is that the policies that we are talking about today as a response to the jobs problem that we have, including the national manufacturing policy and so on, are still to catch up with the problem that there is or that we are facing today. What you're saying is, in some ways, if I've understood you correctly, is that even that solution, which is yet to even catch up with the problem, is not the right one, and we should be thinking afresh.
I think we are fighting tomorrow's battle with the instruments and the thinking of several decades ago.
Okay.
We have to close that gap.
Okay, and how do we close that gap then? Because if I mean, whether it's the political dispensation, the economic dispensation, the thought dispensation, the capability of the economy and the entrepreneurship and the businesses within it, all of it is really geared for only one or two solutions, assuming, of course, the rest of the system or the ecosystem is willing to support it.
Right. I think it's obviously a problem that has been building up for many decades now. In the previous regime, pre-1991 regime, the government stepped in and became essentially the employer of last resort. So where you had issues with people not getting jobs, the government recruited them, whether directly into government or the public sector, banks, public enterprises, whatever. That model broke down in the mid-90s, of course, after liberalization began and the whole rethinking of what the state was going to do or not do. Now, I don't think we can go back to that employer of the last resort model again. The government simply cannot afford it. Society cannot afford it. But at the same time, we've got to think in terms of, as I said, what are the kinds of activities which will actually put the kind of people we have. We have people, they have certain levels of skills. Even if you're going to train young kids, it's going to take a long time to catch up. So right now there is this sort of low skill manual kind of worker profile that is in plenty, and that means construction, that means getting this whole infrastructure game back into play. The highways program I thought was a phenomenal combination of both creating infrastructure and putting people to work. Not just putting them to work, but putting them to work in places where they live, because that's where the roads were being built. So you didn't have to move people long distances to get them to work. And those kinds of they're old solutions. They've been tried before in other countries, but I think they have some relevance today. They're not going to solve the problem entirely, but when you have a problem of this magnitude, you have to break it up as the business management 101. You break down your problem into tangible, into tractable parts, and then you start to address each part. I think that is how we got to approach this. This is not going to be the result of a grand strategy. This is going to be a bunch of different initiatives addressing different needs, different segments of the population, which all add up to a relatively effective approach. So I think that's the approach. That's the philosophy that we've got to bring into this.
Right. So let me come back to the manufacturing part, Subir. So China too, I mean, since that's the only other scale example one can use in contrast, China too faced similar situations of a large population, getting them gainfully employed, and also it had the twin objective of creating all this infrastructure to support it, as well as to sort of ensure economic growth. Now, the hundreds of millions of people who've been involved in the workforce in China have been doing both. I'm assuming building the highways, the railway lines, all the other big infrastructure, as well as being involved in the manufacturing. The manufacturing is what provided the large part of the impetus, particularly from export growth. Maybe the domestic part of the infrastructure creation, investment, and so on took care of domestic consumption. So don't you need both is really my question.
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to have both, but also I think we have to remember, and this is again my point about obsolescence, that the Chinese model, the Chinese growth trajectory of 30 years from the late 70s till the early part of this decade or last decade it evolved in an environment where this sort of very low cost labor was extremely competitive in producing many things that customers wanted.
Right.
Hello, am I still on?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There's some fade in the light here. Now, when you look at the Chinese model itself, they've obviously run into some sort of hurdles because their wage costs have gone up. So they cannot continue along the same path. They've got to think of different ways of doing things.
So isn't that an opportunity then?
It is an opportunity. But in the meantime, there have been so many developments technologically that, just find 30 years, 40 years later, trying to replicate the Chinese model by putting large numbers of relatively unskilled workers into factories. I don't think that's going to happen. So we're in a different environment, both technologically and in terms of market conditions. There's a lot more automation out there. Robotics have become very cheap. We keep hearing about 3D printers. And if you look at the pace at which the 3D printing technology has evolved, it's starting to become like very, very low cost automated production for many things.
Right.
That wasn't the case 30, 40 years ago. You didn't have that kind of competition 30, 40 years ago. So now you're not just competing against other countries, you're competing against technological advancement in the advanced economies where your main export markets lie. So you got to take that into account as well. And I think so it's a different scale of challenge entirely.
Subir,
that's what I'm saying.
Right. So these are the changes on ground as you see them. So how do you what's the policy architecture that is needed to address it? I mean, how do the incoming finance minister, commerce minister, and all the other various industry ministers sit down and approach this? Because I'm assuming that this takes that level of focus and dedication.
Well, I think, yes, absolutely. It should be an employment mission or a jobs mission, I think is the best way to describe it. It cannot be the responsibility of one ministry or a small set of government agencies. It requires complete and total coordination and buy-in from the various interests. Now, I think, as I said, this is not magic wand kind of problem where you do one thing and everything falls into place. Every aspect of it needs to be addressed based on the need, based on the resources. So the macro issue certainly is that you've got to be growing as fast as possible. Without that, you're not going to be able to address the problem at any level, to any extent. Once you do that, then is your growth strategy, is your growth path leaning you, veering you towards the more labor-intensive activities, whatever they may be. It's construction, infrastructure is certainly one part of it. Then there are the textiles and other things. We completely lost the game in electronics, which China has had such a huge advantage in. Why shouldn't we be assembling the iPads in India? You need a certain type of. You don't need high skill for that. You need a certain type of training and discipline. Don't see why we can't do it. We've done very well with automobiles, although there are some recent signs of labor unrest in that industry, but that's we've reached that point of being a global player in the automotive sector. I don't see why that can't be replicated in other sectors where there's a combination of relatively high skill and mass production, mass employment. Those learn from these experiences. But bottom line, our training philosophy has to change. We have to be looking at not only training at the entry level, but also continuing to provide reskilling opportunities as we go along. That's a huge new kind of dimension to the employment issue, which we have to address. And we haven't even started to talk about that because we're still talking about the entry level through the NSTC. Those are all important, no question, and they're critical, but they're not enough.
Right, and as you say, this is the time to leapfrog. Some questions coming in, Subir. Kunal Sekia asks, what are the short and long-term strategies needed to revive the manufacturing sector?
Well, I think we have been in a situation of refusing to face the reality as to why manufacturing has been such a laggard. Every country that we compare ourselves with has grown on the back of manufacturing being the engine, and we did. Now, I think there are three specific issues that we need to address. One is that large-scale manufacturing in the kind of labor, the job security regulation environment that we have will not happen. It's very clear. We have some large factories, but by and large, our manufacturing is pushed into the informal sector, which is very small scale, stay below the radar. Basically, is the strategy. We tried this in 1999 with the new textile policy.
Right.
We scrapped the concept of a reservation for small industry, which we had earlier. In the case of men's garments, so you could build very large factories to produce, a million white shirts, which is what China does. But we didn't go to take the next step, which was to exempt these factories from the imposition, the burdens of the job security regulation. So, nobody had an incentive to build those factories because you took away one constraint, but you kept the other one in place. So, the number of binding constraints from the labor market side, I think, which you have to address. Second is, of course, our infrastructure is horrendous. Our infrastructure costs, the cost that is imposed on our producers because of bad infrastructure takes our competitiveness away completely on most manufactured goods. Even a simple thing like a cost to move from a factory to the port is prohibitive. That's something which has been plaguing us for many years, and I think unless we get to grips with that, manufacturing will not take off. The third is the fiscal situation. Industry has been disproportionately imposed, disproportionately taxed. That has been corrected to some extent by the imposition of service tax. But when we get to the GST, which is essentially a tax which is completely activity neutral, doesn't matter what you do, you will be taxed according to the surplus you generate. That is, I think, a very important basis for reducing the competitive disadvantage that the fiscal system has placed on manufacturing. I think these are three absolutely necessary conditions. Of course, beyond that, technology and clusters and all of those things, I think those will flow once there is a basic set of incentives in favor of manufacturing.
Right. So, question linked to that, Subir, Rajeshri asked, are we meant to be a manufacturing economy? Shouldn't we focus on more services? If you see the situation in America, they focus more on innovation while the manufacturing gets done in China.
A very interesting question, because we don't have a model historically that tells us that you can bypass manufacturing at these levels of per capita income. The US is moving to services, but they're whatever 30 times or whatever the per capita income, and most of these transitions from manufacturing to services have happened at much higher levels of per capita income than we are at now. So if you want to look at historical precedents, we cannot escape the role, we cannot bypass or dismiss the role of manufacturing in taking us from low income to middle or higher upper middle income. Now the question is, are we in a different environment? And perhaps we are to some extent, because we have used the opportunity provided by an opening up of international trade and services. I mean, we are really the first significant exporters of services from the emerging markets group.
Right.
No other service exported, essentially tourism. Nobody has exported the kind of services and we've actually been pioneers in that. So we did that. We used our resources, we used the opportunity, we used whatever technological space we had and so on, and did a phenomenal job of it. Now, problem is that if you don't have a diploma or a degree in software engineering or whatever it is, in computer engineering or computer science, your access to these activities is restricted. Obviously, call centers, BPOs, and so on take you in with a not such a high technical qualification, but you need to be speaking English if you want to work in a call center. I mean, they train you for that, but not everybody gets trained. So when it comes to creating access to employment to very large numbers of people, we have to have channels, we have to have job opportunities which are not so restrictive in nature. I think that's why we have been looking at manufacturing as a huge necessity in terms of complementing the very positive record, the very impressive record of the services sector. That's limited. It's not going to cover the whole population.
Right. So more questions. Subir, Shruti again asks, everyone knows the task is mammoth, but the way the government moves, not sure how 12 million jobs can get created in a jiffy. How does the private sector make this work? Step in and make this work?
I think the private sector is the ultimate creator of the jobs. But what the government needs to do is to ensure that there is a facilitation of job creation. And I come back to the points I made earlier, which is one, we have to be growing as fast as possible. That's when jobs are being created. We know this from our own experience, that employment boomed when growth was high. Two, we've got to be veering, and I'm not saying we should be using sort of a hard kind of a very sophisticated or rigorous industrial policy kind of framework, but we've got to be ensuring that the kind of growth that's happening, the sectors that are driving that growth, must have a high level of labor intensity. And this is why infrastructure and so on becomes so important, because not only do they create the capacity for future growth, but they also are very powerful in generating jobs at the present time. So is our growth basket, are our growth drivers generally veering towards the labor intensive end of the spectrum? I think that's the second point. Now, what you need to do there, you need to ensure that there is no deterrent to private capital, private business or commerce to to their hiring people. And that's what we've done. We've created deterrence through the Industrial Disputes Act and other factories regulations. We've created deterrence people to hire, so they don't want to hire workers. They either use machinery or they find a backdoor through contract and subcontracting and so on, which actually doesn't really work to anyone's advantage. Of course, people get jobs, but they don't have protection. So I think that's the balancing act. The reality is that in 1999, I believe, maybe it was 2000, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, as finance minister, proposed that they would, the government should raise the ceiling, the exemption ceiling, for firing workers without permission. There was enormous pushback on that from a bunch of interests, including labor unions, who actually have a very small membership when you look at it, but they have enormous disproportionate political clout. So that fell by the wayside. We find in state governments, and there's a number of research studies that validate this, that a number of states have found bypass strategies. They have found ways to allow employers to not to be sort of completely bowed down by these job sector regulations. Those states seem to be finding it much easier to attract investment in manufacturing. So let's learn from this experience. The services sector doesn't have these restrictions. It has grown enormously in terms of employment. So I think rather than worrying about protecting the few who have jobs, we should be focused on encouraging people to hire the many who don't. I think that's the fundamental facilitation role that the government has to play. And once that happens, then the private sector will obviously have an incentive to hire low-cost workers.
Right.
Because it's cheaper to hire these workers than it is to invest in machinery in many activities.
Right. So, Subir, a bit of a chicken and egg question. So, if we were to take a step back now, you said that growth is a precondition for this, or a lot of this happening, which is us hitting the jobs absorption target, or is that something that will lead to good higher growth or higher growth numbers?
I think it's exactly that. It's a chicken and egg. I think when we go back to our high growth phase, 2003 to 2008, we have to remember that a major trigger for that, although it was not the only causal factor, there were a number of things came together. But the major trigger for that was the highways program, which actually put a lot of government money into building meaningful infrastructure, and it brought a lot of people into work. And as I said, importantly, they didn't have to move from wherever they were to Mumbai or Delhi or Chennai or Kolkata or Bengaluru. The jobs came to them. That's what something like a roads or highways program does. That's what big nationwide network development. So if we've got highway, we haven't completed the program. There's a whole rail thing going on that we talked about. We should be the corridors, for example, will be very, very important job generators. I think that's the backbone. That's the sort of the scaffolding on which this whole program or this whole employment mission is going to take off. So it starts the process. It breaks the vicious circle, and then there's a self-sustaining kind of momentum that generates that develops. I think that's the way to see this.
Right. How are you broadly seeing the preconditions to growth then at this point of time? Given that we've had a slow phase of growth for the last few years, kicking it back to higher levels, which in turn will create the job creation or the absorption, is not going to be simple. Even assuming things start coming back on track almost magically, what's the kind of time frame that you see?
Well, I think we need to focus on three absolutely critical stress points right now, without which we're not going to get growth back to anywhere close to our aspiration. The first is food. We are having huge problems in agriculture, and because of our persistent food inflation problem, the Reserve Bank has essentially been taken out of the game as far as growth goes. Either they stay where they are and say, look, inflation has to be managed, so we have to keep interest rates high, or they take a huge punt and say, look, let's lower interest rates and try and stimulate growth. But the risks of inflation just getting out of control are very high in that scenario. So that's a difficult judgment. And so far, I think they've made the right judgment in staying focused on inflation control. But that takes them out of the growth here. On infrastructure, we thought we had solved the puzzle. We got the PPP model into place. And 5 years, 7 years later, we find that model really has not worked at all. There are enormous numbers of projects that are under financial stress. The companies that are implementing them are themselves under financial stress. So how do we get more money into infrastructure? How do we get these projects completed so that they can contribute to economic activity? And that's a problem that the government has to solve. And this may involve some more government money coming in. Now, where do you get that from is the challenge that they have to face. But I think the PPP structure is now certainly being under serious question, and we need to redesign it in whatever we can. I don't have a solution here, but these are issues that I'm thinking about and trying to get a fix on. And the third one is exactly what we've been talking about 2 days ago and today, is the jobs. If we've had growth at 9% a year for 5 years, and the number of jobs created were far less than any other country of comparable sort of resources and trajectories would have. And we've got to look at what is stopping people from hiring. And I think it comes back to the issues we've been talking about a little before, which is that there are deterrents, there are barriers to the private sector hiring workers. They don't want to hire workers. And we've got to get rid of those barriers, because if we don't get rid of them, the whole point of growth, translating into welfare, translating to better standards of living, is simply going to be missed. So let's not stand in the way of people hiring workers, employers hiring workers. That's the fundamental driver of economic growth, of economic development.
Right, Subir. So that's a clear message coming through, that the policy framework needs to make it easy for enterprises to create jobs, to hire people, and of course fire them, or more appropriately create a flexible labor environment, and that's a very critical point. Right. So, Subir, last question. Given where things are today, and given where we stand again on the cusp of political change, and therefore all the economic imperatives that will soon come back to the table, are you at this point feeling optimistic, or are you still concerned about what lies ahead?
I'm optimistic, because I think the only situation which the system makes decisive change, takes new initiatives that typically result in positive outcomes, is under the kind of pressure that the economy is today. And for that reason, I compare today with 1991. Things are under enormous stress. There is a new government in the offing. The pressure to act dramatically and decisively is very much on that government, and I hope that they will take it. I'm sort of pessimistic, because I think apart from decisive action, you also need to be thinking about the problems in appropriate ways. And I'm not sure that our policy blueprint for employment has really captured fully the new realities that govern, that dictate the whole employment, productivity, technology nexus. And I think we have to start thinking somewhat differently on how we handle these issues, both in the immediate future and over the life cycle of the worker. We have not given any thought to that. We assume that just because a person gets a certificate from an ASDC endorsed institution, whether to fix machines, motors, or to become an electrician or a plumber or whatever, he's going to be productive the rest of his life. And that's not going to happen in the kind of environment we work in. You can see it from automobiles.
Yeah.
Automobiles that were produced 10 or 15 years ago, as soon as the warranty expired, you could take it to a roadside mechanic and he'd fix it. Today you can't do that, because the guy doesn't have the capability of fixing. So you're stuck to the dealer for the whole life of the vehicle.
Right.
And that completely changes the costs of owning that vehicle. So we've got to start thinking along these lines. And there is a fundamental shift in the relationship between technology, knowledge, organizational structure, which is going to impact us. It's an opportunity for us. It's also a threat.
Right. Subir, I think that that's a great note to end on. I think you've pointed out that there is a clear opportunity in the fact that we've not perhaps gone the whole manufacturing way and invested so much on ground, because the model of consumption and the model of production has changed. Perhaps this is an opportunity for us to leapfrog, but to do that, there needs to be very, very solid policy clarity and backing and understanding, and therefore execution. And that, of course, is the big task for the government ahead. Thank you very much, Subir, for joining us and sharing your thoughts.